Everett Langford had barely reached the gate of the land his family had owned for generations when 3 patrol cars boxed him in. Marissa Vance, the woman running the Briar Glen Homeowners Association, screamed for the deputies to arrest him for trespassing. Everett said nothing. He simply reached into an old leather case and laid a single folder on the hood of the cruiser. Within seconds, the color drained from Marissa's face, because the man she had just tried to get handcuffed held the power to erase her entire association. The morning had started quietly enough with a heavy fog sitting low over the fields as Everett drove his old pickup truck toward Briar Glen. In the bed of the truck sat a single leather case that had belonged to his late uncle Warren Langford, a man who had spent decades quietly holding on to nearly 900 acres of Virginia land and a stack of legal papers. Nobody in the family had ever bothered to read closely. Everett was 42 years old, a land use consultant by trade. A man who had spent his career untangling property disputes for strangers, and never once imagined he would need those skills for his own inheritance. He had come home only because a lawyer's letter told him he now owned something enormous and mostly unexplained, and curiosity had pulled him back to a town he barely remembered. The private road leading to the Langford estate ran directly behind an upscale gated development called Briar Glen, and on the family's old survey map, that road was named Langford Passage, plainly marked as estate property. Somewhere over the years, though, the Homeowners Association had installed an electronic gate across it, bolted up a sign reading private property, and stationed a guard post squarely in the middle of what had once been a simple dirt lane. Everett used the mechanical key his uncle's estate attorney had handed him at the reading of the will, the same key that had sat untouched in a drawer for years, and pushed the gate open without much thought. Within minutes, a white sport utility vehicle came tearing down the drive and skidded to a stop directly in front of his truck. Marissa Vance stepped out in a tailored suit, introduced herself as the chairwoman of the Briar Glen Homeowners Association, and never once asked who Everett actually was. She ordered him to leave what she called HOA property immediately, her voice sharp enough to carry across the whole cul-de-sac. Everett answered calmly that he was simply driving on the road that belonged to the Langford estate, the estate he had just inherited. Marissa laughed in his face and told him the Langford family had abandoned this land years ago, calling him a stranger, hunting for scraps of unclaimed real estate, and she warned him he would be arrested for trespassing if he did not turn his truck around immediately. Russell Pembroke arrived moments later with 2 security guards trailing behind him, and together they boxed in Everett's truck, photographed his license plate, and tried to force him to sign a paper admitting to a violation. Everett refused to put his name on anything. Marissa called the sheriff's office and told the dispatcher that a strange man had broken through a locked gate, entered a private residential community, and was now threatening the board. Deputy Nolan Mercer arrived not long after, and based entirely on Marissa's account and the ownership signage the association had erected, he asked Everett to place his hands on the hood of the truck while he verified his identity. Everett did not resist. He stayed perfectly calm, and instead of arguing, he asked the deputy a single, quiet question. "Before you put handcuffs on me," he said, "wouldn't you like to know who actually owns the ground we're standing on?" Then, without waiting for an answer, he reached into the leather case and pulled out a certified plat map stamped by the county back in 1987 and set it gently on the hood of the patrol car for everyone to see. Everett had built his entire career on exactly this kind of quiet leverage, spending nearly 2 decades untangling messy property disputes for clients who had lost faith that paperwork could ever save them. He had learned long ago that the loudest person in a driveway was rarely the one holding the strongest position, and that panic was usually a far more dangerous reaction than patience. Standing there with a deputy's hand hovering near his own wrist, he felt none of the fear Marissa clearly expected from him. What he felt instead was something closer to recognition, the sense that his Uncle Warren had spent years quietly preparing for a confrontation exactly like this one, tucking away documents that would only matter once someone finally had the nerve to read them. The map made it unmistakably clear. Langford Passage, the main gate, the stormwater drainage system, and a portion of the community clubhouse all sat squarely on land that belonged to the Langford estate. Marissa immediately dismissed the document, insisting it was outdated and that ownership of the road had long since transferred to the association. Everett asked evenly for her to produce the deed showing that transfer. All she could offer, Deputy Mercer, was a faded photocopy, one with no recording number and no county stamp anywhere on it, and she claimed the original was safely stored at the association's attorney's office, conveniently unavailable at that exact moment. Everett studied the signature on that questionable transfer document and noticed something was wrong almost immediately. His Uncle Warren had injured his right hand many years earlier and had signed everything left-handed ever since. Yet the signature on this supposed deed leaned the way a right-handed man's writing leaned, a small but glaring inconsistency that no one else in that driveway seemed to notice. Deputy Mercer, watching the exchange closely, began to doubt Marissa's version of events. He did not arrest Everett, but he asked everyone present to step back from the property until the paperwork could be properly verified through the county clerk's office. Marissa was furious at being undermined in front of the residents who had gathered to watch and to save face. She announced on the spot that Everett would be fined $2,500 for every single day he continued to use that road. Everett asked her plainly when exactly he had agreed to join her association in the first place. She answered that any property falling inside the boundaries of Briar Glen automatically fell under the association's authority, no signature required. Everett pointed to the map again and told her his estate was not inside those boundaries at all. If anything, a meaningful slice of Briar Glen itself was sitting on land that belonged to him. Before he climbed back into his truck, Everett noticed something his uncle had circled in red ink inside the association's own founding bylaws, tucked between pages of otherwise dry legal language. The clause read that the association's authority to manage the community depended entirely on a land use agreement with the owner of the Langford estate. Directly beneath it sat another clause, one that would come to define everything that followed. It stated that if the agreement was ever seriously violated, or if certain conditions were triggered, the underlying landowner held the right to demand the dissolution of the association altogether. Everett realized in that moment that this was never just a dispute over one private road. The entire Briar Glen Homeowners Association might exist only because of an agreement his own family had the power to end. Within hours, Marissa sent a message to every resident describing Everett as a con artist attempting to seize shared community property, and she instructed everyone not to speak with him or hand over any documents under any circumstance. That evening, Everett called Tessa Whitmore, a longtime family attorney who specialized in land ownership and nonprofit governance, and told her plainly that he did not think this was about a single road anymore. "I think this entire association was built on top of my family's land rights," he told her, "and I think they know it." Tessa arrived at the estate the following afternoon, and together, she and Everett spent hours combing through the boxes of paperwork still stacked inside Warren's old study, most of it untouched since his death. What they found was a 1991 agreement in which the Langford family had granted the original developer of Briar Glen conditional use rights over several specific pieces of land, including the main road, the stormwater drainage system, a reservoir along the northern edge of the property, the ground beneath the community clubhouse, and 2 access routes reserved for emergency vehicles. Crucially, the agreement never transferred ownership. It only granted permission to use the land for 35 years, and only under a strict set of conditions the association was legally required to honor for the entire length of that term. Those conditions were specific and, according to the paperwork, non-negotiable. The association was required to maintain the road and drainage system to a professional standard, to never charge fees against the Langford estate itself, to never expand any structure beyond the boundaries laid out in the agreement, to publish an annual financial report for public review, to never use the shared land as collateral for any loan, and to never restrict the Langford family's access to their own property. The 35-year term was set to expire very soon, and buried in the fine print was a termination clause, allowing the landowner to reclaim the rights early if the association committed 3 or more serious violations of those core obligations. Tessa read through the agreement twice before setting it down, reminding Everett that documents like this one were common in the 1980s and 90s, when developers routinely borrowed access from surrounding landowners rather than paying to buy it outright, gambling that 35. The years was a long enough runway for any inconvenient family to forget the arrangement ever existed. She pointed out that the agreement had clearly been drafted by careful attorneys who expected exactly the kind of long, slow erosion of memory that had nearly worked here, if not for the fact that Warren had never stopped watching the calendar. Everett realized that his uncle had likely known for years that this day was coming, and had simply been waiting for someone in the family willing to finish what he had started. It did not take Everett and Tessa long to count at least 4 likely violations already sitting in plain sight. The association had installed a gate specifically to block Everett's access to his own land, a direct violation on its own. The drainage system had clearly not been maintained to anything resembling a professional standard based on the condition Everett had already observed. The community clubhouse had been expanded well beyond the boundary the original agreement allowed. And most alarming of all, Marissa had pledged the entire shared property as collateral against a commercial loan worth $6,800,000, a staggering sum for a small community association to be carrying, especially against land it may never have actually owned. Everett chose not to go public with what they had found right away. He wanted to understand exactly where that borrowed money had gone before making a single move. Tessa warned him that dissolving an entire homeowners association was an extreme step, one that handled poorly could leave ordinary residents without basic services, without shared property, and without any say in what came next. Everett assured her he had no interest in punishing innocent families who had simply bought homes in good faith. His goal, he said, was to end a system built on manipulation, not to destroy the people trapped inside it. Meanwhile, Marissa called an emergency meeting and informed the community that the association would be filing for a court order barring Everett from using any road inside Briar Glen. She also announced a special assessment of $4,000 per household, framing it as a necessary defense fund to protect the community from what she called a scheme to seize their shared land. A handful of residents pushed back on the sudden charge, but Marissa threatened penalties against anyone who refused to pay, and the protest faded quickly under that pressure. A few days later, an envelope arrived at the estate with no return address and no name attached to it. Inside was a copy of the $6,800,000 loan agreement, along with a short handwritten note. It read simply that Marissa knew the association did not actually own the land in question, and it urged Everett to look closely at the signature on page 17. Page 17 carried a signature attributed to Warren Langford, one that purported to confirm the family had voluntarily surrendered all claims to the land tied to the loan. Everett recognized instantly that it was forged. Tessa brought in a document examiner who confirmed after a preliminary review that the signature appeared to have been lifted from an old tax filing and digitally transplanted onto the loan agreement, a clean but ultimately traceable act of fraud. Proving who had actually carried out the forgery, however, was going to require more than a signature comparison. Everett spent 2 full days simply waiting after the envelope arrived, resisting the urge to chase down whoever had sent it, certain that pressure would only frighten the source into silence. Tessa advised the same patience, reminding him that whoever had taken the risk of mailing that envelope had almost certainly done so at real personal cost, and that trust once offered carefully was not something to be rushed. The anonymous sender eventually reached out directly, and Everett learned her name was Denise Carver, the association's former secretary. Denise explained that 3 years earlier, Marissa and Russell had pressured her into drafting a series of resolutions, falsely claiming that residents had voted to approve using the community's shared property as loan collateral when, in truth, no legitimate vote had ever taken place. When Denise objected, Marissa fired her on the spot and threatened to sue if she ever spoke about what she had seen. Before she left, though, Denise had quietly saved copies of internal emails, meeting recordings, and financial spreadsheets that painted a far darker picture than anyone realized. Denise had worked for the association for nearly 9 years, before her dismissal long enough to remember when Briar Glen still ran on modest dues and volunteer labor, and long enough to watch that culture curdle once Marissa took control of the board. She told Everett that the shift had been gradual at first, a few unexplained invoices here, a vendor contract that never went out to competitive bid there, until eventually the entire budgeting process had become something only Marissa and Russell fully understood. By the time Denise started asking pointed questions, she said she had already become inconvenient, and inconvenient people at Briar Glen did not tend to stay employed for long. Those records showed that the $6,800,000 loan had never gone toward improving the community at all. Over $1,400,000 had been funneled to a consulting firm registered under the name of Russell's own sister. Nearly $900,000 had paid for renovations at a private resort with no connection whatsoever to the Briar Glen Association. The remaining funds were buried under vague line items labeled security, legal, and emergency management, a paper trail designed to obscure exactly where the money had truly gone. Everett asked Denise to stay quiet publicly for the time being, wanting to make sure she was properly protected before her testimony was put to use anywhere official. Around the same time, Marissa discovered that Everett had been meeting with disgruntled residents, and she responded by banning any gathering at the community clubhouse that had not been formally approved by the board. Shortly after that, she hired a towing company to seal off the entrance to the Langford estate, with concrete barriers and obstruction. Everett chose not to fight physically. Instead, Everett hired Grant Hollowell, the surveyor who had drafted the original maps for Briar Glen decades earlier, to walk the entire boundary line himself. Grant confirmed that the association's security gate, a landscaped median, and nearly a third of the shared parking area all sat squarely inside Langford estate property. Everett had red survey stakes driven into the ground along the legally confirmed boundary line, marking the truth in a way nobody could later claim to have misunderstood. By the next morning, every one of those stakes had been ripped out of the ground, and Marissa sent Everett a bill for $18,000, accusing him of vandalizing the community's landscaping. What she did not know was that Everett had already installed surveillance cameras along the property line days earlier, and the entire act of removing those stakes had been captured on video from start to finish. Tessa watched the footage with him that evening and told him plainly that they no longer only had proof of a broken agreement. Now she said they had proof the association had deliberately destroyed legal boundary markers. Everett simply told her to let Marissa keep believing she was winning. Marissa scheduled a mandatory meeting at the community clubhouse not long after inviting local media and promising to publicly expose Everett as a fraud in front of the entire neighborhood. Everett arrived with Tessa at his side, but brought no entourage, no security, and no dramatic show of force. Marissa opened the meeting by projecting a photograph of Everett opening the gate weeks earlier, calling it definitive proof of criminal trespassing. And she asked residents to vote in favor of suing him, seizing his vehicle, and building a permanent fence around the entire Langford estate. Russell told the crowd that legal costs could climb as high as $2 million, which meant every household would need to contribute an additional special assessment to cover it. Many residents already paying enormous annual dues, while watching their roads crumble and their drainage systems fail, grew visibly angry. Marissa tried to redirect that anger toward Everett, calling him a man determined to destroy their property values, but when Everett was finally given the floor, he did not raise his voice or argue emotionally. He simply set 3 documents on the table in front of everyone. The first was the Langford family's deed. The second was the original conditional land use agreement from 1991. The third was Grant Hollowell's freshly completed survey. Everett asked Marissa directly whether she was confident the association legally owned the clubhouse they were currently standing inside. She answered without hesitation that she was certain. He then asked her to read the parcel number listed on the property's ownership certificate out loud to the room. Marissa could not produce a valid certificate at all. Everett explained calmly, and without malice, that the very building where they were all sitting had been constructed on Langford land, and that the association had only ever held a conditional right to use it, not ownership. Marissa shifted tactics and claimed the association had earned ownership simply through decades of continuous use of the property. Tessa stepped in to explain that the written 1991 agreement legally blocked any such adverse possession claim, and that the association had always known on paper that the land belonged to the Langford family. Everett went on to lay out the 4 core violations that together were enough to trigger the agreement's early termination clause. The room fell completely silent, as he explained that the Langford estate held the legal right to formally revoke the association's land use rights and demand its dissolution altogether. A murmur moved through the crowd as people began doing quiet math in their heads, recalling every special assessment they had paid over the years, every road repair that had been delayed, every promise Marissa had made at previous meetings that had quietly evaporated afterward. One resident near the back asked aloud whether this meant the clubhouse could simply be taken away from them, and Everett answered honestly that the building itself would remain standing and usable regardless of who managed it, but that the current arrangement propping up the association's authority over it was built on a foundation that no longer held. Marissa scoffed and called it an empty threat meant to frighten the room. Everett responded by producing a certified copy of the bylaws signed decades earlier by the original developer, the county, and the very first board the association had ever assembled. He did not announce dissolution that night. Instead, he laid out 3 conditions the board could still meet to save itself full public disclosure of the association's financial records, the immediate suspension of both Marissa and Russell pending an independent audit, and the cancellation of every fine and penalty issued against the Langford estate. Marissa rejected all 3 on the spot, and had her security staff escort Everett out of the building. Before he was pushed through the door, Everett turned back and told her simply that she had just refused the last real chance to save her association. That same night, Marissa quietly signed off on sending a paving crew to lay fresh asphalt directly over the boundary markers Grant had confirmed only days earlier, apparently hoping to erase the evidence before anyone could formally document it. The crew arrived at 2 a.m, confident that no one would be watching the estate at such an hour. They were wrong. Everett's infrared cameras recorded every license plate, every worker, every written work order, and Russell himself standing on site directly supervising the operation. Everett called Deputy Mercer to the scene not to demand an arrest, but simply to have the situation documented through an official report. Nolan quickly realized this had grown far beyond an ordinary neighborhood dispute. He sealed off a section of the property and forwarded the entire file to both the sheriff's office and the county prosecutor's office for review. Marissa showed up soon after accusing Everett of staging the whole scene and demanding Nolan arrest him for obstructing association-approved construction. When Nolan asked for the paving permit, the document she produced listed a parcel number belonging to an entirely different piece of land altogether. Everett revealed that every boundary marker had actually been fitted with a hidden underground locator device weeks earlier, meaning paving over the surface markers had done nothing to erase the survey data itself. Marissa understood, standing right there in the dark, that her middle-of-the-night decision had only made the evidence against her stronger. For a moment she said nothing at all, watching the paving crew's headlights sweep across freshly laid asphalt that had solved absolutely nothing, and Everett almost felt something close to pity for her before he remembered the $18,000 bill she had sent him. Only days earlier for stakes, she herself had ordered removed. That flicker of sympathy did not last long. Russell, growing visibly frightened, quietly reached out to Everett and offered to hand over the association's financial records in exchange for staying out of any criminal proceedings. Everett refused any private arrangement of that kind and told Russell the truth belonged with the official investigators, not in a backroom deal. Russell turned back toward Marissa instead and tried to wipe the financial data from the association's server before anyone could subpoena it. But Denise still had her own backup copies of everything, including one email in which Marissa had written plainly that if the Langford estate ever passed to a new owner, they needed to control the road before that person ever read the termination clause for themselves, proof that Marissa had understood the danger from the very beginning. Tessa finished preparing a formal notice of violation, running 84 pages long, methodically laying out every offense the association had committed. It documented ownership fraud, obstruction of access, illegal alteration of boundary lines using property the association did not own as loan, collateral concealment of financial records, destruction of survey markers, unauthorized fee, a collection, and the use of a forged signature. Under the terms of the original agreement, the association had 30 days to cure those violations before losing its rights entirely. Marissa made no attempt to cure anything. Instead, she used association funds to file a countersuit against Everett, seeking an injunction and damages. Not long after a court officer arrived at the estate to serve Everett with the paperwork, and he read the final page and simply smiled, because Marissa, in her haste to attack him, had attached a full copy of the association's own bylaws to the filing, unknowingly handing the court the exact document that confirmed his right to dissolve her organization in the first place. Marissa's request for an injunction sought to bar Everett from using Langford Passage, from contacting any resident, and from interfering with the association's operations in any way. At the preliminary hearing, the association's attorney portrayed Everett as an opportunistic investor, exploiting an outdated piece of paper for personal gain. Tessa answered plainly that an organization could not simultaneously claim ownership of land while relying on a written agreement that openly admitted its rights were only ever conditional. Judge Meredith Sloan asked both sides to produce the association's official corporate registration records, and that single request cracked the case wide open. It turned out the Briar Glen Homeowners Association had failed to file its required corporate maintenance reports for 2 consecutive years, leaving its legal status administratively suspended the entire time. Marissa had continued collecting fees, signing contracts, and taking out loans throughout that period regardless. On top of that, the bylaws required a 7-member board to approve major decisions, yet Marissa had systematically removed 4 members who had opposed her, leaving only 3 people behind, nowhere near enough authority to legally approve the massive loan in question. The courtroom that day was smaller than the community clubhouse, but felt far more consequential, its wood paneling and quiet formality, a sharp contrast to the shouting matches that had defined every prior confrontation between Everett and bien Marissa. Judge Sloan had a reputation in the county for reading every exhibit personally rather than relying on summaries, and she made both attorneys wait in silence for nearly 10 minutes while she paged through the corporate registration filings herself. When she finally looked up, her expression told Marissa's attorney everything he needed to know before she had even spoken a word. Tessa walked the court through the emails, the survey reports, and the signature analysis one piece at a time. An attorney representing the lending bank appeared as well, informing the judge that the bank had just discovered the collateral behind its own loan might never have belonged to the association at all. The bank froze the remaining loan funds immediately and demanded an emergency audit of its own. Marissa tried to shift blame onto Russell, insisting she had only signed documents he had personally prepared for her, but Russell fired back just as quickly, telling the court that every major decision had come directly from Marissa herself. The 2 former allies sat several feet apart at the same table for the remainder of the hearing, no longer bothering to hide the fracture between them. Each one now visibly more concerned with protecting themselves than with protecting the partnership that had carried them this far. Judge Sloan denied the association's request for an injunction against Everett outright. She went further, ordering that the association could spend no funds beyond essential operating costs, could not delete or alter any records, could not impose any new penalties, and had to surrender its complete financial books to an independent auditor without delay. Marissa left the courthouse furious, and outside on the steps, she told reporters that Everett was simply trying to force families out of their homes by dismantling their association. Everett corrected the record publicly, soon after explaining that dissolving the association would not cost anyone their home, since every homeowner's individual property rights remained fully protected, regardless of what happened, the board. What would disappear, he said, was the apparatus that had been quietly exploiting those very homeowners for years. When the 30-day cure period expired without a single violation being corrected, Tessa confirmed it, and Everett signed the formal notice revoking the association's land use rights and officially triggering the dissolution process for the Briar Glen Homeowners Association. By now, Marissa understood exactly how much power was slipping away from her, and she moved quickly to fight back one last time. She sent a letter to every household warning that Everett. She organized a protest outside the gates of the Langford estate, hoping public pressure might turn the tide back in her favor. Everett refused to meet that anger with anger of his own. He opened the gate, invited resident representatives inside, and walked them through his actual plan for the transition ahead. He promised point by point that residential roads would remain open to everyone, that access to the reservoir and drainage systems would never be cut off, that no resident would be charged fees during the transition period, that a new community service district would be formed and led by residents themselves, that all shared property would be placed into an independent trust, and that the results of the ongoing financial audit would be made fully public. One older resident, a retired school teacher who had lived in Briar Glen since before Marissa ever joined the board, told Everett quietly afterward that she had spent 3 years believing the association was simply underfunded rather than mismanaged, and that hearing his plan laid out so plainly had been the first time, in a long while, anyone had explained anything to her, without also asking her for more money. Others admitted they had never fully read their own bylaws, trusting the board to act in good faith simply because that was what boards were supposed to do. Many residents realized in that moment just how thoroughly Marissa had misled them for years. The audit ultimately uncovered nearly $3,200,000 in spending that could not be accounted for through any legitimate community expense. A portion of that money had flowed directly into shell companies with clear ties back to Marissa herself. Denise agreed to testify formally once she learned the extent of what auditors had found. Realizing Denise was cooperating, Marissa showed up unannounced at her home and tried to pressure her into retracting her testimony, a conversation her own doorbell camera happened to record in full. Marissa warned Denise that if the association was dissolved, everyone would lose everything they had. Denise answered simply that residents had already lost money because of Marissa, not because of Everett. Around the same time, Russell attempted to leave the state entirely, but investigators intercepted him for questioning before he could go far. Facing mounting pressure, he handed over a hard drive containing private recordings from a series of closed-door board meetings. In one of those recordings, Marissa was heard laying out her plan to seize control of the Langford estate, step by step, describing how she intended to install a gate to block the family's access, stockpile fabricated violation notices, manufacture the appearance that the land had been abandoned, petition the court to recognize the association's long-term control over the property, and eventually sell off a portion of the estate to a resort development partner. It became clear that having Everett arrested for trespassing on the very first day had never been an accident. It had been the opening move of that entire plan. Deputy Mercer soon arrived at the association's office carrying a search warrant. Marissa stood in the doorway, still insisting that Everett was the true criminal in all of this. Nolan handed her a printed copy of an internal email that read in part that they needed to have him arrested before he ever got the chance to open Warren's case. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Marissa had no response left to give. The final dissolution hearing drew nearly every resident of Briar Glen into the courtroom, along with local reporters covering the story closely. Marissa arrived in a dark, tailored suit, trying to project the same composure she always had. Her attorney argued that even if some violations had occurred, dissolving the entire association outright would ultimately harm the very community it was meant to protect. Tessa countered that it was the unlawful continuation of the current board, not its dissolution, that was actively causing the harm. Grant Hollowell presented his survey findings once again, confirming for the record that the association's key structures sat on Langford estate land. The document examiner confirmed formally that the signature on the loan agreement had been forged. Denise described in detail how Marissa had pressured her into fabricating board resolutions and hiding the true destination of association funds. Russell, hoping to lessen his own exposure, confirmed under oath that Marissa had directed the entire scheme from the very beginning. Deputy Mercer presented the footage showing Marissa ordering the removal of survey stakes and authorizing the middle-of-the-night paving job. The independent auditor confirmed that more than $3 million had been misused. Tessa laid out 3 separate independent grounds supporting dissolution: a serious violation of the conditional land use agreement, the association's failure to maintain valid corporate status, and a board that had approved major transactions using forged documents and authority it never legally possessed. Reporters filled the back rows, and several residents who had once stood loudly behind Marissa now sat with their arms crossed, listening to testimony that painted a picture of their community very different from the one they had been sold. At every annual meeting for years, When Marissa was given the chance to speak, she offered no apology at all. Instead, she told the courtroom that Briar Glen had only thrived because she had been strong enough to make decisions others were too afraid to make. She accused Everett of trying to tear down everything she had built. Everett was then called to the stand, and he told the court plainly that Briar Glen was never Marissa's legacy to begin with. It had been built with residents' money on his family's land and on the trust of hundreds of people who never realized how badly that trust had been abused. He said he was not asking to take anyone's home away. He was only asking the court to end an organization that had betrayed the very purpose it was created for. Judge Sloan delivered her ruling clearly and without hesitation. She recognized the Langford estate's rightful ownership of the disputed land, dismissed every fine ever levied against Everett, and formally found that the association had committed serious, repeated violations of its founding agreement. She revoked the current board's land use rights, entirely ordered the dissolution of the Briar Glen Homeowners Association under direct court supervision, appointed an independent administrator to manage the transition of assets and obligations, and referred the entire financial fraud case to the county prosecutor for criminal review. Marissa stood frozen in place as the association's official corporate seal was surrendered right there in the courtroom. The woman who had once called the police to have Everett arrested for trespassing was now standing silently as a judge confirmed that her own organization no longer had any legal right to exist on his land at all. As she made her way out of the courthouse, investigators stopped her to begin formal proceedings related to fraud and document forgery. Everett did not celebrate. He simply looked out at the residents, still waiting for answers, and told them quietly that it was now time to build something that had always belonged to everyone in the first place. 6 months later, Briar Glen no longer operated under its old model at all. Under the supervision of the court, its shared property had been transferred into a new non-profit structure called the Briar Glen Community Trust, and every homeowner was granted a single equal vote in how it was run. Every contract, every dollar collected, and every dollar spent was now published openly for residents to review. Langford Passage reopened to regular traffic, and Everett signed a new long-term road use agreement, one that this time clearly protected the interests of both his family and every resident who relied on that road. Meetings under the new trust looked nothing like the meetings Marissa used to run. There was no raised podium, no security guards stationed at the doors, and no special assessments announced without warning. Residents who had once been afraid to ask questions began showing up regularly, reviewing budgets line by line and volunteering for the very oversight roles that had never existed under the old board. No individual could mortgage or sell any piece of shared property anymore without the approval of at least 2/3 of the homeowners. Community fees dropped by nearly half, once the fraudulent contracts and inflated management costs were finally stripped away. What remained of Marissa's and Russell's seized assets went toward partially reimbursing residents for years of misused dues. Russell reached a cooperation agreement with prosecutors and formally accepted responsibility for the role he had played in the scheme. Marissa faced criminal charges connected to financial fraud, document forgery, and the destruction of evidence, and in the end her downfall was described by nearly everyone involved, not as an act of revenge but as the simple, inevitable consequence of wielding power without any real limits. Deputy Mercer visited the estate not long after apologizing to Everett for nearly placing him in handcuffs on that very first morning. Everett told him he had nothing to apologize for, since he had done exactly the right thing by pausing to check the evidence. The real mistake, Everett said, only happens when someone refuses to look at the truth even after it has already been placed in front of them. Denise went on to join the new Financial Oversight Committee formed under the Community Trust, and she later said that reviewing an honest budget for the first time in years felt strangely unfamiliar after so long spent watching numbers get quietly rearranged. Grant finished the final official boundary survey and placed a simple stone marker at the entrance of Langford Passage. It carried no mention of Everett's name at all, only a single line carved into its face, reading that power is granted to serve a community, never to own it. In the closing days of that long ordeal, Everett stood on the porch of his Uncle Warren's old farmhouse, watching residents drive freely along the road that Marissa had once sealed shut. Tessa asked him almost in passing whether he had truly intended to dissolve the association from the very beginning. Everett told her he had given them every possible chance to correct their course. Marissa did not lose the association because Everett had simply outmatched her. She lost it because she had believed right up until the very end that no one would ever bother reading the fine print she had worked so carefully to bury. On the morning Everett first arrived at Briar Glen, they had called him a trespasser on his own family's land. 6 months later, no one stood behind that gate deciding who was allowed to pass through it anymore. The gate itself was still standing, but it stayed open now, a quiet reminder that power can shadow the truth for a while, yet the truth always finds its way back home in the end.